The descent to Station 9 didn't feel like moving. It felt like being erased. The pressurized transport pod, a cramped titanium sphere barely large enough for me and my gear, hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled my molars. Outside the reinforced acrylic porthole, the ocean transitioned from a vibrant turquoise to a dull, bruised cobalt, and then, finally, into a black so absolute it felt heavy. I watched the depth gauge on the console. 2,000 meters, 3,000 meters. The pay for this 6-month stint was more than I'd made in the last 5 years combined as a deep-sea welder. They told me I was essential personnel. They told me I was a stability monitor. But as the light of the world above vanished entirely, I felt more like a sacrifice being lowered into a dark, watery throat. Station 9, this is Transport 1. My pilot's voice crackled over the headset. He was a man named Elias who had looked at me with a strange, pitying squint when I boarded. "We're approaching the drop-off point. How's your stomach?" "Quiet," I lied. My gut was doing slow, oily somersaults. "Just ready to get out of this tin can." "Be careful what you wish for, kid," Elias muttered. "The can you're moving into is the only thing standing between you and about 16,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. You crack that shell and you don't even have time to scream. You just become a red smudge in the water." The pod lurched. A massive floodlit structure emerged from the gloom below. Station 9. It looked like a cluster of interconnected white eggs anchored to the seabed by thick, obsidian-colored cables. It was beautiful in a sterile, terrifying way. A lonely spark of human arrogance at the bottom of the world. Docking in 3, 2, 1. A heavy thud vibrated through the hull as the docking collars locked. The hiss of equalizing pressure whistled in my ears, a sharp, piercing sound that made my head throb. "Transfer complete," Elias said. His voice sounded distant, almost hollow. "The previous guy, Miller. No, wait, that was the last job. The previous guy was named Eris. He left his logs on the desk. You might want to give him a look. He was thorough." "Thanks," I said, grabbing my duffel. "One more thing," Elias added, his voice dropping an octave. "If you see the lights of a city down here, don't report it. Just close the curtains and go to sleep. People who report cities don't get invited back for a second tour." The hatch hissed open. I stepped into the station. The air was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of copper and old sweat. The transport pod detached, and I watched through the small portal as its lights ascended, growing smaller and smaller until they were just a pinprick. And then, nothing. I was alone at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. I made my way to the command module. It was a circular room filled with glowing green monitors and the constant rhythmic ping of the sonar. In the center sat a small metal desk. On it was an emergency operations manual. The cover was stained with coffee and something dark and sticky. I flipped it open. The first 10 pages, the ones that should have contained the standard operating procedures, had been neatly sliced out with a razor. Taped to the inside of the back cover was a yellowed piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was cramped, the ink bleeding into the paper as if the person writing it had been pressing down with all their might. The depth gauge protocol. 1. The sonar will occasionally show a landmass. There are no islands in the trench. Do not adjust the coordinates to find it. 2. Maintain a temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit. If the room suddenly feels hot, do not turn on the AC. It means it is hugging the hull. Wait for the chill to return. 3. If you see a light outside the porthole, do not mimic its pattern. It is not a rescue sub. It is an angler, and you are the bait. 4. The blue hour. Every day at 4 p.m., the external cameras will show a forest. Do not look at the monitors for more than 60 seconds. 5. If you hear your own voice coming from the comms line, answer it. Tell yourself you are dead. If you don't, it will come down to prove it. 6. The suit. If the airlock cycles without you touching it, put on your pressurized suit. Not to go out, but so it can't see your face when it walks in. I stared at the list. My first instinct was to laugh. This was exactly like the stories the divers told in the bars at Subic Bay. A way to scare the fresh meat. Then I looked at the thermometer on the wall. It was exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I heard it. Ping. I looked at the sonar screen. A massive solid shape was appearing on the edge of the display. It was jagged, shaped like a mountain range. According to the map, the seabed here should be a flat, featureless plain of silt. Ping. The landmass was moving, and it was heading straight for the station. I stared at the sonar display, my pulse drumming a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. The green sweep of the radar arm rotated with agonizing slowness, and with every pass, the mountain grew larger. It wasn't just a landmass. It was a wall. A jagged, vertical cliffside that shouldn't exist in the deepest, flattest part of the abyss. Ping. The distance readout flickered. 500 meters. 400 meters. Station 9 to surface control, I said, my voice cracking as I fumbled for the comms headset. I have a massive sonar anomaly at my 10 o'clock, requesting immediate verification of local topography. Do you copy? Static. A thick, wet sound like someone dragging a heavy chain through mud. Surface, do you copy? A voice broke through, but it wasn't the crisp, professional tone of the base operators. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, a vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and rattle directly in my skull. It sounded like a choir of thousands, humming a single dissonant note. I ripped the headset off and threw it onto the desk. Rule 1. Do not adjust the coordinates to find it. My hand was already hovering over the joystick for the external floodlights. Every instinct I had, every year of training as a welder and a technician, told me to look. You can't fix what you can't see. If a tectonic shift was happening, if a landslide was coming, I needed to know. I gripped the joystick. I felt the sweat slicking my palms. Rule 2. Maintain a temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit. I glanced at the wall-mounted thermometer. The needle hadn't moved yet, but the air in the command module suddenly felt heavy. It was the kind of heat that precedes a summer storm, thick, humid, and smelling faintly of scorched iron. I looked back at the sonar. The mountain was now less than 100 meters away. At that scale, it should have been visible through the reinforced acrylic porthole even without the floodlights. I turned toward the thick glass. Outside, there was nothing but the great black. But as I watched, the blackness seemed to shift. It wasn't the absence of light. It was something solid. It was a texture. I saw pale white ridges, curved, massive, and spaced perfectly apart. It wasn't a mountain. It looked like a rib cage. The station groaned. Not the high-pitched scream of metal under pressure, but a low, vibrating hum, like a tuning fork. The temperature gauge began to climb. 60 devini gradi pek, Fahrenheita. 70 viens grads pek, Fahrenheita. 70 pieci gradi pek, Fahrenheita. A wave of heat rolled through the room. I felt a bead of sweat drip down my spine. My hand moved toward the AC controls, my fingers itching to flick the switch to max cold. But I stopped, the words of the manual screaming in my mind. If the room suddenly feels hot, it is hugging the hull. I froze. I didn't breathe. I imagined a massive, soft-bodied thing, miles long, curling its flesh around the titanium eggs of Station 9. I imagined the heat of its metabolism radiating through the hull. The station nothing more than a warm pebble in its gut. Then the clock on the console flipped to 1600. The monitors on the wall, the external camera feeds that usually showed only darkness and the occasional ghost shrimp, flickered. The static cleared, and my jaw dropped. I wasn't looking at the bottom of the ocean. The camera showed a forest of towering, translucent trees. Their leaves were a shimmering, bioluminescent blue, swaying in a wind that shouldn't exist 5 miles down. The ground was covered in a carpet of white moss, and between the trees, things were moving. Tall, graceful silhouettes with too many limbs, dancing in the blue hour. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The heat, the sonar, the fear. It all began to melt away. I felt a desperate, aching need to walk out there, to breathe in that blue light. Rule 4. Do not look at the monitors for more than 60 seconds. I checked my watch. 40 seconds had passed. The trees began to change. The blue light intensified, turning into a piercing electric violet. The graceful silhouettes stopped dancing. They turned toward the cameras. They didn't have faces, just vertical slits that began to pull apart, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The leaves on the trees weren't leaves. They were eyes. Thousands of them, all blinking in unison, focusing on the station, focusing on me. 55 seconds. I lunged for the monitor power switch. My fingers felt like lead. The heat in the room was now stifling, the air smelling like rotting seaweed and ozone. 59 seconds. I slammed the all-off button. The room plunged into darkness, save for the pale green glow of the sonar. I collapsed into the chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I waited for the heat to pass. I waited for the it to let go. 10 minutes later, the needle on the thermometer began to drop. 74. 72. 68. The silence returned, deeper and more oppressive than before. I looked at the sonar. The mountain was gone. The sea floor was flat again. But as I sat there in the dark, a voice came over the comms line. It wasn't the choir this time. It was clear. It was crisp. It was my own voice. "Hey, buddy," the voice said from the speakers. "You okay?" It's getting a little cramped down here, isn't it? Why don't you open the airlock? I think I left my keys outside. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I sat in the center of the command module, my hands gripped so tightly to the armrests of my chair that the plastic groaned. The voice coming through the speakers wasn't just a likeness. It had my specific cadence, the slight rasp I get when I'm dehydrated, the way I clip the end of my S sounds. It was me. Come on, Elias said you were a sharp one. The voice, my voice, continued. It sounded casual, almost bored. It's lonely out there. The trees are gone, the ribs moved on. It's just me in the dark. Don't you want to see what I found? Rule 5. If you hear your own voice, tell yourself you are dead. My tongue felt like a piece of dry leather. I forced myself to reach for the microphone. My hand was shaking so badly I missed the button twice. You aren't me, I whispered. Oh, I'm more you than you are right now, the voice replied instantly. I'm the version of you that didn't hide. I'm the version that opened the window. Just say it, David. Open the hatch. Let's finish this. I closed my eyes. The logic of the world above was a paper-thin shield down here, and it was tearing. I am dead, I croaked. I'm already dead. The speakers emitted a sharp, ear-piercing burst of static. Then the voice changed. It dropped into a guttural, wet growl. Liar, I can hear your heart. It's beating like a trapped bird. Thump, 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 thump. The comms line went dead with a definitive mechanical click. I sat in the ensuing silence, waiting for the next horror. I didn't have to wait long. Clunk. The sound came from the aft section of the station, the airlock. It was the heavy, industrial sound of the external pressure seal disengaging. Rule 6. If the airlock cycles without you touching it, put on your pressurized suit. I scrambled out of the chair, nearly tripping over the power cables. I bolted toward the locker where the heavy-duty atmospheric suit was stored. It was a massive yellow suit of hard-shell armor, designed to withstand the weight of a skyscraper. As I fumbled with the magnetic seals of the leggings, I heard the inner door of the airlock begin to hiss. Something was equalizing. The station's internal computer didn't scream an alarm. It didn't report a breach. According to the sensors, everything was normal. But I could hear the wet, heavy footsteps. Slap, drag, slap, drag. Whatever had entered the station was heavy, and it was dripping. I shoved my arms into the suit's sleeves and slammed the chest plate shut. I grabbed the helmet, a thick dome of reinforced glass and steel, and twisted it into the locking ring. Click, lock. The suit's internal oxygen supply hissed to life, the steady whoosh of air providing a momentary sanctuary. I stood there, a yellow titan in a tiny room, staring at the corridor that led to the airlock. The lights in the hallway began to flicker. In the strobe-like flashes, I saw a shadow turning the corner. It was tall. It was too tall for the ceiling, its head tilted at a nauseating angle to fit within the corridor. It wasn't wearing a suit. It didn't have skin. It looked like it was made of a million tightly packed, translucent worms that pulsed with a faint, sickly violet light. The same light from the Blue Hour forest. It stopped 10 feet away from me. It didn't have a face, but as I watched, the worms shifted, pulling back to create the shape of a mouth. "You're wearing the suit," it said. The voice didn't come from the creature. It came from inside my helmet, vibrating through my own jawbone. That's cheating, David. I want to see your eyes when I tell you the truth about the pressure. It took a step forward. The floorboards beneath its feet didn't just creak. They turned to a dark, viscous liquid where it stepped. The station was melting around it. I backed up until I hit the sonar desk. I looked at the monitor one last time. The sonar wasn't showing the mountain anymore. It was showing a heartbeat, a slow, massive rhythm that encompassed the entire trench. Ping, ping, ping. I wasn't in a station. I was in a lung. And it was time for the abyss to exhale. The creature stopped. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its focus. It was a pressure, a physical weight pushing against the glass of my helmet. Inside the suit, the air was becoming stale, smelling of my own panicked sweat and the sterile ozone of the oxygen scrubbers. Cheating, the creature repeated. The violet light pulsing beneath its translucent skin flared. You think the titanium keeps me out? You think the rules are for me? It raised a long, shivering limb and touched the wall of the corridor. Where its fingers made contact, the white paint bubbled and ran like candle wax. The metal underneath didn't just dent. It softened into something that looked like raw, wet muscle. I looked down at the sonar desk. The edges were drooping. The plastic casing of the monitors was beginning to sag, dripping onto the floor in long, black strings. I realized then, with a jolt of pure ice in my veins, that the manual's 6th rule wasn't about hiding. Put on your pressurized suit so it can't see your face when it walks in. It wasn't that the suit kept the creature out. It was that the suit was the only thing in this room that was still real. Everything else, the station, the airlock, the very air I had been breathing, was part of the it. Station 9 wasn't a structure built by the corporation. It was a shape the trench had taken. It was a lure, a deceptive membrane grown out of the seabed to hold a human being in place while the digestive process began. The suit is a shell, the creature whispered, its voice now vibrating through the soles of my boots. And shells are meant to be cracked. The floor beneath me gave way, not with a snap, but with a squelch. My heavy yellow boots sank 4 inches into the metal, which now had the consistency of warm liver. The station was dissolving. The walls were beginning to weep a clear, thick fluid. Gastric acid. I struggled to lift my leg, but the station held onto me. I was being absorbed into the floor. The violet light of the creature intensified, and for the first time, I saw what was behind the worms. There were faces. Small, distorted human faces trapped in the translucent mass, their mouths open in silent, eternal screams. I saw Aris. I saw the lookouts from the years before. They weren't dead. They were the nervous system of this thing. The blue hour is coming again, David, the creature said. It leaned in, its faceless head inches from my helmet. But this time, you won't need the monitors. You'll be the trees. You'll be the wind. I reached for my utility belt, my gloved fingers fumbling for the emergency flare. It was a magnesium charge, designed to burn at 5,000 degrees, hot enough to sear through anything. If I was going down, I was going to give this thing an ulcer. I ripped the flare from the belt and struck the igniter. The flare roared to life, a blinding, brilliant white light that hissed in the oxygen-rich environment of my suit. The creature shrieked. a sound like 1,000 violins snapping at once, and recoiled. The violet worms recoiled, blackened by the heat. The metal walls of the station shutted. The entire structure let out a wet, guttural groan. I used the moment of distraction to wrench my boots free from the floor. The suit's servos whined in protest, but I broke the suction. I didn't run for the airlock. There was no airlock. I ran for the emergency escape pod, which sat at the very end of the module. I reached the pod's hatch. It was still solid. The corporate-made escape vessel was the only part of the station that wasn't meat. It was a foreign body, a splinter in the creature's side. I threw myself inside and slammed the manual override. As the pod's bolts fired, I looked back through the porthole. The station wasn't a station anymore. It was a massive, pulsing throat, closing in on itself. And standing in the center, unmoved by the heat of the flare, was the creature, waving a pale, translucent hand. "See you at the top, David." My own voice echoed one last time in my helmet. The pod shot upward like a cork. The pressure change was violent, the G-force pinning me to the seat. I watched the depth gauge climb. 5,000 meters. 4,000 meters. But as I looked at my own hands in the light of the pod's emergency HUD, I saw a flicker of violet light beneath my fingernails. The suit hadn't been enough. I hadn't just breathed the air. I had become part of the cycle. Chapter 5. The decompression. The ascent was a blur of screaming metal and bone-shaking vibration. The escape pod was designed for a quick rise, but at these depths, quick was a relative term that felt like being crushed by a giant's palm. I watched the depth gauge spin. 3,000 meters. 1,000 meters. 500. The pressure was easing, but the internal pain was only beginning. Every joint in my body felt like it was being filled with liquid lead. My vision blurred, not from the G-force, but from a shifting, prismatic haze that danced across my retinas. It was the violet light. It wasn't just under my fingernails anymore. It was in the veins of my wrists, pulsing in time with the sonar's ghost echo. Ping, ping, ping. The pod breached the surface with a violent jolt, bobbing like a cork in the dark Atlantic swells. I scrambled for the manual release, my fingers fumbling with the latch. My hands were no longer shaking. They were stiff, the skin taking on a waxy, translucent sheen that looked more like polished bone than flesh. The hatch hissed open. The air of the surface world hit me, cold, salty, and wonderfully real. I dragged myself out onto the small flotation collar of the pod, gasping for breath, looking up at the stars. "I made it," I whispered. My voice sounded thin, but it was mine. But the silence of the ocean surface was broken by a low, mechanical hum. I looked out across the water. A recovery ship was already there, its spotlights cutting through the dark. It was the Vesper, the mothership that had dropped me off. I waved my arms frantically. "Over here, Station 9. I'm here." The ship drew closer, its massive hull looming over my tiny pod. I saw figures on the deck, men in yellow slickers moving with practiced efficiency. A crane lowered a recovery cage toward me. As I stepped into the cage and felt the winch begin to pull me upward, I looked down at the water one last time. The ocean wasn't black. Beneath the surface, for miles in every direction, a soft violet glow was spreading. It looked like a forest of translucent trees swaying in the currents. "Hey, you okay?" A deckhand shouted as the cage cleared the railing. He reached out a hand to help me out of the hard suit. "Don't touch me," I rasped, backing away. "Whoa, easy there, Dave. It's okay. You're home. You've got the bends, probably. Let's get you to the med bay." I looked at the deckhand's face. He looked so normal, so solid. I looked at his hand, warm, pink, and full of blood. Then I looked at my own arm. Under the bright floodlights of the ship, the transition was undeniable. My skin didn't just look waxy, it was becoming a window. I could see my own radius and ulna, but they weren't white bone anymore. They were glowing violet stalks. The worms were there, millions of them, weaving themselves into my muscle fibers, replacing my DNA with the code of the trench. I felt a sudden, overwhelming heat. Rule 2. If the room suddenly feels hot, it is hugging the hull. I wasn't in the station anymore. I was the station. I looked at the deckhand. I didn't see a person. I saw a brighter source. I saw a mass of heat and energy that needed to be balanced. "The temperature," I whispered, my voice now vibrating with the dissonant choir of thousands. "It's too high on deck. We need to maintain 68 degrees. The deckhand frowned, stepping closer. "What are you talking about, Dave? You're shivering." He reached out and grabbed my shoulder. The moment his skin touched mine, the ship groaned. Not the metal, the concept of the ship. The deck beneath our feet began to soften, the steel turning into a dark, viscous liquid. The lights of the Vesper flickered and turned a piercing, electric blue. "Dave?" the man asked, his voice beginning to distort, layered with the gurgling sound of a throat filling with silt. "What's happening?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth was pulling apart, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that were growing in behind my human ones. I looked up at the bridge of the ship where the captain stood, frozen in horror. I wasn't a survivor. I was a spore. The trench hadn't let me go. It had used me to reach the surface. It had used the rules to ensure I stayed intact just long enough to be delivered to a larger host. I felt the first blue hour of the surface world beginning. Across the deck, the men weren't men anymore. They were silhouettes with too many limbs, dancing in the violet light of the ship's dying floodlights. I reached for the ship's intercom system, my fingers now long, translucent talons. I didn't have to think about what to say. The words were carved into my very marrow. "Attention all crew," I said, my voice broadcasting across every speaker on the Vesper. "Please listen carefully. There are 6 rules you must follow if you want to survive the night." I looked out at the dark horizon, where the lights of a distant coastal city were just beginning to twinkle. "Rule 1, I whispered, as the ship began to sink into the softening sea. "If you see a light in the valley, it is looking for a brighter source.